Palestinians have gone everywhere. They have gone to the International Criminal Court. They have gone to the International Court of Justice, to the Security Council, everywhere, to Human Rights Council, everywhere. And it is Israel and the US and Europe that have blocked, defunded, and defamed each of these institutions and the leaders of these institutions. It only means that their cause is just so powerful, and that the Israeli position, and not only Israeli, it's the position of modern liberal armies, is so weak that they cannot even stand in their own institutions, on their own ground.
So today we're talking with Abdelghany Sayed. I'll just quickly read your bio so people know who you are. Abdelghany is a PhD student at the University of Kent Law School. He has a lot of background in international law. He's worked as a legal analyst and researcher both in Egypt and abroad at the International Criminal Court at The Hague. And he's also done work for UNICEF and the OECD. And his work is particularly relevant at the moment because he's doing research on the idea of human shields and how the idea of human shields plays into international law, public discourse, and popular culture. So, because of that, we're very excited to talk to him. Let me just ask you right off the bat. I mean, if you go on social media right now, you can see a lot of people talking about, as usual, the concept of human shields, Hamas using Palestinians as human shields in Gaza. It's often used as a way to justify violence. It's probably going to be used in the coming days during Israeli strikes. So, as someone who's looked at this topic more than most people from a legal lens and just from popular culture, what do you make of this? How do you think about this issue?
When these people, when these international lawyers and diplomats and journalists speak about human shields, in Gaza, in Afghanistan, in Mali, etc., they're already making a very, they're pretending to be objective observers, but they're already making a very radical, in fact, political assessment of the situation. They are they are portraying themselves as moral. They're portraying the other as either vulnerable or a savage. So the other is always a savage or a victim, and we are the saviors. We are gonna save the victims from the savages. If you look in reality, in how Palestinians portray themselves, how Afghans portray themselves, how Colombians portray themselves, you will find that the relationship between the people who refuse to leave and these armed groups is not necessarily a relationship of support, but they're kind of from the same environment. They are, like, for example, if you look at the Palestinian armed groups in Gaza, I'm not saying that Palestinians in Gaza support Palestinian armed groups. Actually, many of them don't. But Palestinians in Gaza, they want to live. It is their land. They don't want to leave this land. And you would be called something Muhammad, and I'm also called something Muhammad. You're a fighter, I'm a civilian, but we're actually cousins. So it's I really think the main issue that we should look at is that there is an armed force conducting overseas warfare, and this overseas warfare is illegitimate. They're exporting violence to the urban environment uh, of these locals, and this is really uh, what is at stake. I want to tell you another example, one final example. Neve Gordon, an international lawyer, and Nicola Perugini, another academic, they observed something. They observed that Israeli military objectives are located in Tel Aviv, and they're also located in the vicinity of Gaza. Many of them are located in the vicinity of Gaza, next to the kibbutzim and to Israeli communities. Many US military objectives are located in the heart of US cities. After all, you have now drone warfare when you have a guy sitting in Utah or in whatever in the US with a joystick, and he's taking direct part in hostilities. When attacks happen, when Israeli, when Palestinian armed groups conduct attacks inside Tel Aviv and against or in the vicinity of the kibbutzim in the vicinity of Gaza, no one ever thinks of Israeli civilians as human shields. And we always think that Palestinians are conducting indiscriminate attack. What is different here? What is different is that we are never ready to think of the image of the Israeli state and the Israeli civilian as the image of the shield and the shielded, the gangster and the bank client, the immoral terrorist and the vulnerable civilian. We think of Israeli citizens as people who have agency, as civilized people. They know what they want, they do what they do, they do what they want to do. And we think of the Israeli government as a democratically elected government that cares about its people. It's a legitimate government. So once you say human shields in Gaza, you're already making a political statement that Hamas is not democratically elected, that Hamas is illegitimate, etc., etc. And all this is fine. My problem is, does international legal discourse and does contemporary diplomatic discourse and do contemporary journalists, are they ready to admit that they are making a political assessment? The answer is straightforward, in a straightforward manner, no. They always like to think of themselves as moral, as professional, as objective and neutral. So it is not propaganda. It's actually, I think, it's a genuine Orientalist view of the other. The other is either always a savage or a victim. Those in power in the Arab world, in Afghanistan, are always despots, the Oriental despots. They are not legitimate. They are ready to use their own people as human shields. Uh, the US also made this claim about Saddam Hussein. He's an Oriental despot. He used human shields, his own people as human shields. And later, only like 40 years later, I'm talking about the 1991 war, 40 or 30 years later, we now know that this was just a myth. Of course, he did actually use human shields, but that's another issue. He used foreign human shields. But the US always wanted to portray him as a person who's an Oriental, illegitimate despot who uses his own people as human shields. Later, we now know that's all nonsense. With this discourse, the US has been able to was able to justify the killing of 407 Iraqi civilians, not a single combatant, 100% civilians were transformed into into pieces of, I don't know how you call it, like قصص متفحمة. I don't know how this you say that in English. They were transformed into little pieces in a second in the attack in 1991 against Al Amiriyah shelter. And the US, the justification was that we took all feasible precautions to confirm that this was a military objective. Unfortunately, our intelligence were wrong. We thought it was a military objective. We thought it was an operation room for the Iraqi army. It turned out to be a civilian shelter. This idea is that Iraqis use their people as human shield. A civilian shelter would be used as a shelter shield. So it's okay, maybe we should go ahead and attack it. Everyone in the international community, not only states, even rights activists, lawyers, do not question what if the US intentionally target these civilians. No one asks this. Even Human Rights Watch, their biggest demand was to open an investigation to investigate whether the US has taken feasible precautions to minimize civilian damage. Why hasn't the US delivered advance warning? There is no assumption that the US maybe wanted to target civilian. Why not? Why don't we talk about this conversation? The reason is that international law shields states, modern states, from the claim that they intentionally target civilians. They only engage in mistakes. They only engage in disproportionate attacks and mistaken proportionality assessment. But they never engage in willful targeting, despite massive factual evidence that they actually do. And now we can talk about the 500 people in the Gaza hospital if you want.
Remember the videos from Iraq? Remember the videos from Iraq from when the soldiers were shooting civilians and laughing, and the famous video where he goes, "Oh, look, there's another one."
That was the video that got Julian Assange in trouble, the one that was leaked from the helicopter, and we had the audio of the helicopter pilots shooting them down and actually celebrating it. And it ended up being civilians and actually Reuters journalists. They were carrying a camera that apparently looked like a gun. But yeah, not even just that. Like it's stated U.S. policy to make life unlivable for civilians with sanctions so that the civilians turn against the regime. So these are policies that they know are going to make life hell and even potentially kill people, as it did in Iraq in the 90s. So it's not the case that every policy is simply collateral damage and a mistake. In some cases, they know very well that people are going to die, innocent people, because of their policies. So it's just that we don't apply it to military strikes. We only accept that when it's things like sanctions. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if military strikes do that.
Under international law, there is a very important crime under international law of war or international humanitarian law, which is the crime of collective punishment. So of course it's a war crime to implement measures calculated to basically bring about instituting some kind of a regime of collective punishment. This could be many things. This could be uh, collective punishment in Palestinian villages, how all entrances are closed. They call it the checkpoints. Israelis and Americans call it the checkpoints, and in Europe, of course, they call it checkpoints. Palestinians, this word checkpoint does not exist in Palestinian dictionary. Every Palestinian would not understand if you say checkpoint. They call it barriers. Punitive demolition, um, uh, many other measures can be used as collective punishment. Uh, it is very useful to think about the US attacks and Israeli attacks and Europe's attacks in Africa and in Mali, for example, as collective punishment. Not only in these places, everywhere really. To think about the Colombian armed conflict, when the Colombian army breaks into a village and they do everything, the looting, killing, whatever violations you can think of. We can think about this as collective punishment, and then we can trace this to the colonial origin of everything. So Lale Khalili, she's an academic. She has written about counterinsurgency, um, like colonial wars, which later developed into counterinsurgency wars. Now they're called counterterrorism wars, as exceptional legal frameworks where many things can be allowed, including collective punishment. Colonial counterinsurgency includes this. And this is not analysis, this is not academics speaking, this is the US military speaking. So if you look at Vietnam, the US formal policy was to drain the pod. So drain the pond, sorry. Yeah, the idea that basically Vietnamese fighters, this is basically the idea of people's war from Mao Zedong, that Vietnamese fighters, Vietnamese guerrilla, Vietnamese resistance, depend on a very important advantage, which is that the Vietnamese environment is like a sea, and they are like a fish, like fish. The US Army cannot see them and cannot shoot them because there's a sea of forests, of people, of trees. What can we do? We need to drain the pond. We need to convince the people, on the one hand, not to be part of this, not to be uh, uh, silent to the guerrilla warfare from their environment. And we also need to really, literally drain this sea, burn these fucking trees, kill these people, destroy these homes. So this has been a colonial and also post-colonial, like modern and contemporary tactic that has been used long ago. It has been used for the first time in Palestine in the 1936 revolution, when the British they summoned their experts from British Tanzania, from India, and they summoned French experts from French Algeria, Congo, etc., to get their expertise in crushing people's revolt, the revolt of the people. And at this time, they introduced the practice of using Palestinians as human shields, closing villages and making barriers, instituting watchtowers, etc. Indiscriminate killing, unlawful detention. Now it's very easy for every Western commentator to call Israelis in Gaza as hostages, but somehow, we never call Palestinians as hostages. We only call them detained. And maybe we should analyze this legally to see if they're unlawfully or arbitrarily detained. They're hostages. If Israelis in Gaza are hostages, these were hostages and these are hostages. And today there are 900 West Bank Palestinians inside Israeli jails. They are hostages. So anyway, so all these tactics were brought from other colonies to Palestine by the British Colonial Office. This included using Palestinians as human shields. All these actions, as you said, Eric, all these actions have one goal, which is to lay bare the local environment with a view to controlling it. You have a watchtower to see. Now, of course, you have so much advanced technologies to see, and you have civil registers, civil registries, etc., to see and to record the movement of the population. At the same time, you demolish people's houses if it's proven that they support or are relatives of or they know terrorists, because you want basically this sea to expel the fish. Basically, you would use the locals as human shields in order to be. Why did British officers and Jewish gangs use Palestinians as human shields in 1936? It's simple: to see the urban environment. They wanted to infiltrate the Palestinian village, the Palestinian city, so they cannot, because they are stranger, they are foreigner to this environment. So they need someone from the village in front of them so that they can see and scan and get these fighters to fight face to face. This same tactic was exported from Palestine, from Mandate Palestine to today's Palestine. And these experts, British and later Israeli experts were trained by British experts, counterinsurgency experts. And now Israeli experts have exported these counterinsurgency or counterterrorism or colonial wars tactics to the rest of the world. In Colombia here, you have the Israeli military training paramilitaries on basically counterinsurgency tactics. They have exported this to many other countries, including, well, some country that we are from. And they have exported these tactics to many other places in the world. And this includes Jenin in 2002, when the Israeli forces destroyed the urban fabric in order to be able to see Jenin and to eliminate the resistance. What is happening today in Gaza is just another episode of colonial wars and of collective punishment. And it can be very much traced back, as you mentioned, to US practices. It's doctrine. It's really very, very carefully created doctrine. But in reality, even the US is just another follower of a much earlier tradition of colonial warfare and measures to control the local population abroad.
Do you think there's anything that could be done to stop Israelis from killing all the Gazans and doing whatever they want? Like, it seems like there is a shift in global consciousness a bit. People are waking up to the atrocities of Israel, which is good. But the vast majority of powerful countries still support Israel quite a bit over Palestine. So, do you think there's anything that could be done? Do you think we've lost this one?
Well, as a lawyer, the answer would be easy. Yes, Palestinians should use legal instruments, etc., etc. But I'm not really um, uh, a big fan of this. I consider myself a lawyer who lives in society. So everything that is very legal and strictly and technically legal has to be part of this social context. So, of course, I think Palestinians should use legal institutions, but I really also think that the Arab youth and the peoples of the global south, but also global north, the marginalized everywhere, they should basically stick to trying to understand whatever fields they are studying, media or law or whatever, critically as parts of society. This means what? This means that it is good to speak about what is happening in Gaza in international legal language, in strict international legal language, but it's also always very good to recall always the broader context in which everything is happening. So basically, today we are seeing that Palestinians have gone everywhere. They have gone to the International Criminal Court. They have gone to the International Court of Justice, to the Security Council, to everywhere, to Human Rights Council, everywhere. And it is Israel and the US and Europe, by varying degrees, that have blocked, defunded, and defamed each of these institutions and the leaders of these institutions. So now you have a massive war of misinformation and propaganda, and you see AI generated, uh, you see artificial intelligence entering the war zone for the first time. I think maybe first. I don't know if it's the first time, but anyway, you see that. At one point, there was international institutions that were supposed to carefully examine evidence. These institutions are International Criminal Court, UN commissions of inquiry, etc. It is Israel that blocked these. The UN commissions of inquiry, the first one, 2009, had a head, Richard Goldstone, Judge Richard Goldstone. He was defamed, he was threatened, and he was attacked fiercely as an anti-Semite and a self-hating Jew by Israel. The second, um,
What exactly was he trying to do? Like, what was the action that was going to be taken against Israel in that case? In that case, like, what specifically was the international institution going to do against Israel?
this is this is a very good question. In fact, nothing. This UN commission of inquiry just sought to gather evidence and to examine what is fake, tell it apart from what is genuine, what is authentic, etc., etc. Just information, nothing more than that. Later, in the 2014 war, a UN Commission of Inquiry was created. The head of it, he was called Professor William Shabas. Same thing happened with him until he had to resign. It is Israel that does not want the liberal legal institutions to perform its task. This does not mean that Palestinians should simply, and Palestinians don't. I'm not saying that Palestinians should do anything. They're doing already. Palestinians do not trust these institutions, but they go there. And the fact that these institutions have blocked Palestinians does not mean anything. It does not mean that Palestinians trust liberal international institutions. It only means that their cause is just so powerful, and that the Israeli position, and not only Israeli, it's the position of modern liberal armies, is so weak that they cannot even stand in their own institutions, on their own ground, which is the ground of positivist, traditional, mainstream international law. However, it's of course, I mean, Palestinians know very well what these institutions are, and they interact with them uh, uh, basically to gain. I mean, they know what is the maximum that these institutions could do. They're just so helpless that they would go to a place like the International Criminal Court. But would the International Criminal Court bring Palestine what it deserves? Even 5%? Certainly, certainly, certainly not. Um, yeah, what people should do now is basically what I really think is that Instagram accounts that Instagram accounts, films, music, uh, cultural activities that through which Palestinians represent themselves and tell the people who they are, so that the world just knows that they are just people. They simply don't want to leave their home. They simply feel horrified when they see a soldier inside their home, confining the whole family to the corner of the room with their big arms. They feel horrified, just like the Israelis that felt horrified on the 7th of October. So, so I think all this is what attacks the mainstream diplomatic media and legal discourse from its core. We really need to know who Palestinians are. We need to read their poetry, to look at their paintings, at their films, look at their Instagram accounts. I think this is the solution, because once the world knows that they're not heroes and they're not terrorists, they're just people, a bunch of farmers and workers and employees and intellectuals who just want to live where they have grown up. They are just like Americans. They have felt horrified. Iraqis and Afghans and Palestinians, they also felt horrified when they saw American and Israeli soldiers in their homes. When Jerusalem was occupied in 1967, Palestinians were horrified in their homes. They were displaced, they were killed, everything, and they were taken, they were detained, but no one spoke about this as a massacre, spoke about this as a hostage taking. Why? Because the international legal discourse is biased to any practice carried out by states, and certainly there is a race factor and a cultural bias to the global north. This is beyond doubt. So now it was sufficient to see Israelis horrified by the mere presence of Palestinian fighters inside their urban spaces to consider that there is terrorism, there is a crime. We did not, the world did not wait to see whether a crime happened or not. Let's assess. These people taken, are they unlawfully detained? Are they detained? Is this prolonged detention? Or is this arbitrary detention? All these terms are different. Is it justified by considerations of necessity and proportionality? No one waited. Everyone considered them hostages. Why do we never think of modern liberal armies' violence this way? I would say one last thing. The philosophers of the global war on terror, like Michael Walzer, they speak about the peculiar evil of terror is that they say that it's not only that it kills the innocents, it's not only that. The idea is that it invades and violates the everyday safety and security of the civilian. This is perfect. I agree. I don't disagree. The problem with that is that war too does that. It also invades and violates the security of the people. Of course, this is something that Talal Asad notices in his, I think, brilliant book. It's called On Suicide Bombing. So he notices that probably by this discourse you mean that, well, war um, it happens in the context of war. So war violence happens in the context of war violence, whereas terror happens in the everyday. And that's why terror is super evil. But even this is wrong. because the everyday is status quo. What about prolonged occupation? So now the everyday of Palestinians is war. Does this make this everyday uh, less worthy of security? Actually, it makes it much worthy of defending, because it's so violent that violence and war has become the everyday. So the big difference in reality between terror and war violence is that terror is carried out by armed groups of brown people, and terror is carried out by states, and mainly by white people's states. So it was just sufficient to see a brown informal attacker, a white formal military as a defender, and to see the horror on white European faces. Once we saw this, we were very much ready to condemn, without waiting, without carrying out legal assessments, to condemn everything as a massacre, as terror, as a war crime, and even some legal analysts called the 7th of October a genocide. It is amazing. Let's discuss if it's a genocide. But why are we so ready to judge this so fast? On the 7th of October, already these judgments were made, while people of Iraq, Afghanistan, Mali, Colombia, Egypt, Ethiopia, I don't know, you name it, Rwanda, Burundi, wait for years and decades, and they go even to legal institutions that examine things carefully and professionally and work according to standards. They go there and they spend decades, and they never get a single right returned. Not criminal liability, not civil compensation, and not even the right to truth. Today, the victims of the American attack on the Iraq Amiriya shelter, until now, there is no truth. No one speaks about this as a target against civilians. We still, we have still recorded it as some kind of a of a of human evil, like the evil of wars. It's just recorded against an unknown criminal. The whole world is sad for the death of these people, as if they just died in an earthquake. That's what international law does to massive violence of liberal armies.
Um, and by the opposite notion, a sort of a contrast from that is when supposedly international law, you can correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not the lawyer you are, allows for an occupied population to resist their occupiers with violence. So, how does this apply, or how should this apply to things like Hamas?
I mean, the conduct of Hamas in general, in public discourse and in legal discourse and inside legal institutions by judges who work according to very strict uh, legal technical standards, is always judged on the face of it as criminal, as an indiscriminate attack or an attack targeting civilians. This has been the case since the 2008 war, and of course, because Hamas is quite recent, Hamas is very recent. Any violence, any resistance by colonized people have been judged as unlawful. Even violence against straightforward combatants during the colonial times and today is still called terror. So let's not think that it's the first time that the violence carried out by Palestinian resistance called as terror. It was not on the 7th of October. When Palestinians attack Israeli soldiers with massive arms occupying their land in the West Bank, this is called terror too. Okay? So the world was very ready, is always very ready to judge any attack by Hamas as indiscriminate and as intentional targeting of civilians. I I don't mind reaching this conclusion actually, but I'm just wondering, why are we always so ready to judge the conduct of Palestinian armed groups as unlawful, while we are ready to wait and see always with the conduct of Israeli and American armies. So, what is unasked, the questions that were not asked about the conduct of Hamas? Let's talk about the 7th of October, for example, as an extreme example. Very extreme, because before the 7th of October, the conduct of Hamas was not like that. Or actually, wait, before we talk about that, let's go back to the 2014 war. The 2014 war, we think about the conduct of Hamas as indiscriminate, as intentionally targeting civilians, and Israel as a moral army that only targets combatants. But if we look at the numbers, we'd find that Hamas actually killed 70 something Israelis. Two of them are civilians, the rest are combatants. Israel killed 2,300 or 400 Palestinians. Only 600 of them were combatants. The majority is civilians. Somehow, it is still recorded in human consciousness that it is Palestinians that target civilians, that terrorize civilians, but Israelis only target civilians. Now, on the 7th of October, the whole world, including international lawyers, were very ready to call it a massacre, were very ready to call the detentions as hostage taking, the intrusion into homes as terror. I think this could be the case. But in reality, I'm wondering, why are we not giving this some time to think about it? Why don't we think about about this operation as an operation of um, a resistance group under international law, which means it's an international armed conflict, uh, in the context of a war of national liberation? Why don't we think of the attacks as attacks directed at military objectives? You know, in the vicinity of Gaza, there is basically military objectives, military bases everywhere. These kibbutzim are surrounded by military objectives. The festival is surrounded by military objectives. Why don't we think about all these attacks as attacks against military objectives, and then we tell apart the civilians from the combatants, and we go through the proportionality assessment? Let's see, how many civilians did they kill and how many combatants did they kill? Why don't we think about this operation as an operation to win land inside the borders of what is now called as Israel, in pursuance of legitimate, internationally recognized as legitimate targets, and the blockade, and the occupation of Gaza since 1967, and the apartheid regime and occupation of the West Bank, dismantle the settlements of the West Bank, because these, and basically the continuing crime of settlers. You know, settlement in the West Bank constitutes a crime. What crime? It's the crime of transferring the population of the occupying power to the territory, to the occupied territory. This is a crime. Um, why don't we think also about all this as an operation to free Palestinian detainees and prisoners of war, or maybe let's call them hostages? If the international community is very much ready to use the term hostages, why don't we use the term hostages for Palestinians? So it is very possible to think about, to ask these questions. It's very legitimate to ask, yeah, well, they're trying to control land, and they had to enter people's homes for necessities, for exigencies of combat and of controlling land, in order to in pursuance of national liberation goals. Maybe all this would fall, but why don't we ask these questions? Now you have many civilians. I have seen so much footage of the 7th of October. Much of it shows Palestinian fighters willfully targeting civilians. Some of it shows Palestinian combatants using violence against these civilians. Some Israeli civilians were injured, uh, um, grave injuries, etc. I have seen horrified people in their homes, But I've also seen other videos that shows how Palestinian combatants were treating these people very well. It's of course it's propaganda, it's war propaganda. But well, this happened. I've also seen other videos, CCTV, Israeli CCTV, showing combatants, Palestinian combatants, seeing civilians in their kibbutzim and not shooting them. They would leave them go. Okay, so why don't we look at this conduct and see what is individual war crime, like like one single combatant killed, and what is maybe according to a plan. So is it possible to accuse Hamas or to accuse the Palestinian armed groups of all the crimes? I think it's possible, but let's wait and see uh, if actually these groups planned willful killing, planned violence, planned sexual violence, etc., etc. For example, I have seen also footage showing Israeli civilians in the vicinity of Israeli fighters. So is it worthy? Is it worth it to discuss whether these civilians were killed in combat, were killed in basically crossfire, or maybe as human shields? Because international lawyers have told us about the challenges of fighting in urban warfare for decades, and they have justified, literally and without exaggeration, the worst crimes in the last 3 decades. The worst crimes in the last 3 decades were justified in one name: challenges of fighting in urban warfare. Fine. Are Palestinian fighters challenged by fighting in a kibbutz? Maybe they are. Why don't we wait and see? No one wanted to wait. It was, instead of this, very easy to say hostages, to say massacre. No one even knows how Israelis in Gaza are being treated. Are they treated well? Let's wait and see. Are they treated in accordance with international humanitarian law and international human rights law? No one, no one is waiting. And a main definition of hostage taking, it's the detention that is combined with threatening to kill, injure, or indefinitely detain these people to force the enemy to do or abstain from doing something. Have Palestinian armed groups threatened to kill or injure or indefinitely detain, implicitly or explicitly? The answer is no. What is bigger than the answer is no one sought. What is more important than the fact that the answer is no is that no journalist, no lawyer sought to see, to basically inquire this fact. It was just easy to say hostage, but but no one can show us any evidence that Palestinian armed groups have expressly or implicitly made any threats.
You mentioned earlier before we started recording that this is just about capitalist expansion and a fight really waged by the global West or the global North against, not the global West, the global North against the global South. Yeah. So just the rich fighting the poor, and they have all the money and resources.
I think instead of thinking about Palestinians as human shields, and instead of thinking about instead of thinking about the possibility that Palestinian Gazans are human shields, instead of thinking about the possibility that Israel has sought to minimize civilian casualty, or that the US respects this principle of distinction and proportionality, etc., I think I think it's very useful, instead of thinking this way, to think of all this violence as wanton violence that has one goal, which is kind of a big gentrification project. I think it's very useful to think of Israel as kind of a big gentrification project. I think it's very useful to think of what is now called Israel, and I think it's very useful to think of Gaza as something like the Al Warraq Island, like the Warraq, Gzirat Al Warraq in Egypt, or like any gentrification project. For example, here in Colombia, we can think better of it as how Bogota, the capital, has been expanding and eating all the communities surrounding it and building malls and big skyscrapers, etc., etc. I think this is way more useful if we read the original papers of um, the earlier papers of the Zionist movement. The first one we can talk, for example, about the novel by Theodor Herzl, Altneuland, or The Old New Land, where he has written this in 1886, I think. Um, and in this novel, he speaks about the establishment, the erection of the new society, and he wishes that a new Jewish community will be erected in this land of savages and barbarians. He portrays very straightforward two images of civilized Europeans moving into a land of savages and making it a villa uh, in the jungle, a garden in the jungle, just like how modern day Israeli politicians and European politicians refer to Israel. So he has envisaged this advanced society on the land of the savage. Um, After he wrote it, Hertz made it clear that this is not just a novel, but an action plan for a very practical project that he wishes that one day it will become reality. From day one, this has been the mission in Palestine. When the British took the mandate over Palestine, Palestine was mandate class A, which is according to the mandate system of the League of Nations, meant that Palestine was ready for independence, but it just needed some more guidance to self-govern and to become more civilized. This was the case with most of the mandates, with all mandates. But with Palestine, it was a very distinct reality, which is that the British guided Palestinian prosperity by precise and self-governance by precisely making them indefinitively subjected to foreign domination. Um, and this foreign domination is what will bring it civilization and prosperity, skyscrapers, technology, computers, all that. So I think, and if you look at at how Israelis basically, like in Israel, everyone knows there's a kind of a proverb. They say, "Aretz bli am, la'am bli aretz." Um, uh, a land without a people for a people without a land. So that was the whole justification. It's a land without a people. Uh, of course, it was not literally a land without a people. Palestinians were there, but they were so unworthy, they are savages, that they were invisible. If you look at some artworks from Jewish artists in the 30s and in the 20s, painting Jewish communities being erected in the vicinity of Palestinian villages, and put these paintings next to footage from reality. At these times, you will find that they would paint the Palestinian village as a bunch, as a group of just mountains or hills or something, empty spaces. The Palestinian was always invisible, and this is what brings the Palestinian with the local in the global South. The local is the marginalized local is marginalized, is invisible, and we want to make a big project. Capital wants to expand, and we don't see you. We are, apologies, we are just going to expand at your expense. Um, so now you see the pictures depicting Jaffa, which later became Tel Aviv, and showing you how Tel Aviv became so amazing, skyscrapers. Um, uh, Basically, it looks like Europe, and you compare it with the old Jaffa and Sheikh Mu'nis Palestinian neighborhoods, which were basically, like traditional and unappealing. Um, so uh, Israel, from the beginning, in a very straightforward manner, from Theodor Herzl and all the early Zionists, was a project that would make a little Europe in the Middle Eastern jungle, in the Arab jungle and in the African jungle. Today, it's amazing when you see Israeli politicians and diplomats speaking about resettling Gazan Palestinians in Sinai, and then we will bring you back once we take care of Gaza and make it, you know, kind of civilized. This discourse, you don't see it anywhere except in gentrification projects. This is Maspiro in Cairo. This is the discourse against people from, I don't know, from Manchet Nasser, from Douaya, here in Colombia, in Bogota, everywhere in the world. This is gentrification. We are going to remove you, and we're going to bring you back. Some of you, we're going to bring you back, and we're going to compensate you. After we and those who will come back to a modern city. In reality, the problem is that they never come back. And the problem is that the compensation is always never enough, not only materially, but also psychologically, because these people have relationships with the land. The Palestinian Gazans live next to the sea. They have the sea and they're fishermen. You cannot take them to Sahara al Naqab, the Negev, for example. And you cannot take them to parts in Sinai where they don't have access to the Mediterranean Sea. This is their village. This is their environment. Sorry. So, so just the same way that the artisans in Maspiro in Cairo, for example, they didn't want to go. They have their workshops there. Or in any of the big markets of artisans, of whatever, carpenters or whatever, they did not want to leave because it's their workshops, it's their environment, they know it, and the environment knows them. They did not want to leave. So I think it's very useful to think about the human shields discourse, not only the human shields discourse, but about the modern international legal discourse in general, both international law of war, which is the law that regulates how you make violence, and public international law on jus ad bellum, which is the law that regulates the right to use violence, the right to go to war, both laws. It's very useful to think about all this as one thing. It's a civilization mission. It's a mission to eliminate the barbarian, the imagined barbarian, and this very much relates to Orientalist understandings of that barbarian. And it's a way to save the victim. Again, it's an Orientalist image of that victim, and to bring prosperity into this land. All this is good, except that it never happens. The colonial project was that. Colonialism was to bring civilization, was to make Africa and the Middle East and like the Arab world and the Latin America, um, basically lands of prosperity and progress, etc. But in reality, it was looting and killing and never-ending trauma and never-ending um, um, basically um, structures that govern until now these countries. Until now, we have dictatorships in our countries, not only because it's our responsibility, it is our responsibility, but because there are colonial structures that govern today economically, but also politically. So, for example, why is the Arab world made of a bunch of dictators? Because imagine if the Arab world has one democratic leader. Would any Arab people be silent? Certainly not. If Egypt, well, let's not talk about Egypt. If any country, if Jordan, if Jordan has a democratic leader, I highly doubt that Alembi bridge would stand until now from the massive numbers of people um, taking to the streets to support Palestine.
Yeah, they wouldn't want to be client states as well, serving the US empire.
Precisely, precisely, precisely.
Your whole speech about gentrification was brilliant, man.
I
And
really loved it.
I loved listening to that,
Yeah,
man. Thanks for that. That was
yeah.
great. And you know what? It's the exact same thing that the Americans did in the 1800s when they called it manifest destiny, which I'm sure you're aware of.
No, I'm not. I would actually like to hear.
This is the exact same argument that you learn, and what you're told in US history class in high school is that there was a project and you called it Manifest Destiny. It's propaganda, it's PR, it's meant to this idea that it was the destiny of the United States to have a civilization from sea to shining sea, from the eastern seaboard to the western seaboard, and that it was this was how they were going to bring prosperity and civilization. Of course, what they were ignoring was the fact that this land was settled by Native American Indians, by the indigenous people. But in the American mind, it was their duty. So settlers would go, and they would go increasingly out west until they reached California. In the process, millions of indigenous people were killed in order to get that land. And now it's just referred to in two words: manifest destiny. That was the original gentrification project of the United States. So everything you're saying about Europe, it also applies to the American Empire. And then once they finished settling it in the end of the 1800s, that's when they began to build their empire, because they ran out of land on the mainland. They had settled all of it and they needed new markets. So the late 1800s, you start to see this debate from the Americans about what can we do. And so that's when they start a war with Spain. They go to the Philippines, they go to Cuba, they go to Puerto Rico, they go to Guam, they annex Hawaii. That is when they begin to build the American empire, because they ran out of space in the American homeland, because manifest destiny had ended, and now they need to gentrify new colonies abroad. And that process has continued basically until today, with the modern forms of colonialism through American companies expanding their products and their reach and everything around the world. And so everything you're saying applies to the American empire as well. I thought that was a beautiful speech. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you too. I took notes because I think it's always very useful for me to get other colonial and post-colonial contexts. Especially the U.S. has other impressive examples.
Impressive,
But
yeah.
yeah, like if we agree on this framework, I think it's better to look at the U.S. and Israeli and European international legal discourse during war, instead of taking it seriously, instead of dealing with it as a serious discourse uh, that seeks to analyze situations and bring information and corroborate information, etc. I think it's much, much more useful to think of the colonial project and to think of the counterterrorism discourse today as a kind of discourse that looks more like the discourse of real estate agencies. Like when you see Mountain View with a beautiful modern um, compound where people look like us, and where you will not have to deal with the other the other kind of low class Egyptians,
It's
etc.
always a white family that looks really happy. They always have these white families,
Yeah.
like a blonde woman and
Precisely,
little white kids.
precisely, precisely. I think it's much better to think of Israel and the US and the European colonial project as a real state, as a project of a real estate agency, and then to compare, and then to think about uh, Western discourse in general and modern international legal discourse in general as TV advertisements of new compounds.
Yep.
Mm. Can I just ask you one last question?
Yes,
Um,
please.
from an international law perspective, do you think Egypt has any moral obligation to open the borders and let civilians in? Like, are we complicit in like the potential genocide? That
No, certainly not. I think the discourse about Egyptian complicity is I would not call it propaganda, because I really don't think propaganda, but it's an Israeli discourse that comes from a genuine understanding or misunderstanding of who the Palestinians are. To Israel, Palestinians are just, they say Haravim. They don't say the Palestinians. They say the Arabs. Those Palestinians are not Palestinians. Palestine is fake. The Palestinian flag is fake, etc., etc. And those Palestinians can go to any country of the 22 Arab countries. This is not exceptional. This is not my analysis. This is mainstream political discourse in Israel for 80 years. More than 80 years, actually, because it's even before the proclamation of the State of Israel. Um, so the idea that Egypt should just open the border, get them in Sinai. Um, uh, I think this is basically, Israelis are now the good Israelis are now trying to think that, well, it's not only our problem, we are not only complicit in this, because there is a lot of very humane people. Most of them are humane people, who also are also not happy with all the killing. And you cannot go to bed when you see all these children and these people dying. It's not easy. And so it's kind of, like, when you break with your partner because you're a bad partner, and then you can't sleep because you have guilt. So you go and speak to them in a very sweet manner, and you try to be very nice to them. It's about guilt, because you do this not necessarily because you're a good person, um, or of course you are, but there's guilt. You need to be able to go to bed. So Israelis need to go to bed, and they are trying to think that, well, we are not the only ones who are closing the borders. There is also the Egyptian side. This, of course, omits the idea that 70% of Gazans are not from Gaza. Gaza is a big refugee camp. Gazans are from Bir Saba, known as Beersheba, from Asdod, known as Ashdod, and these areas, and even from Tel Aviv, surrounding Gaza. They are refugees. So when you say the blockade by Egypt and Israel, it's ridiculous to me. To me, when I see a commentator saying there's the blockade by Israel and Egypt, this is funny. This is funny. It's not funny, actually. It's just annoying. Um, so no, there is a context. If anyone should open the border, it's the Israelis, and that's why I really actually liked, uh, in a very exceptional moment of history, I loved the approach of Sisi when he said, "Yeah, take them in the Negev desert," which is basically, this is kind of sarcasm. He said, "We're not going to take them in Sinai. You can take them in the Negev." This is kind of sarcasm, but very dark sarcasm. It basically means implement the right of return. Israel has an obligation to allow Gazans, among many other Palestinians, to return to their lands for 75 years. And Israel has not honored this obligation. So when Sisi said that, he basically meant, well, honor your right of return obligation. So is Egypt complicit? The answer is clearly not. Does Egypt have an obligation to allow humanitarian aid, and even arguably to allow Palestinians to enter into the Sinai territory? Actually, yes. The obligation of Egypt to allow Palestinians to go inside is we can argue a lot about that, because Egypt can only justify its need to not allow refugees to its borders. But of course, there's a very strong case to say that yes, Egypt is obliged to let Palestinians enter the territory. Egypt is obliged to let humanitarian aid enter. Um in reality, however, we need to remember that Egypt has been very eager on letting humanitarian aid, and that Israel has bombed the crossing many times, and that Israel does not want the crossing to be open unless it is open to resettle Palestinians in the Sinai Peninsula. So what Israel wants is straightforward ethnic cleansing. That's what it is. It's a new Nakba. They want to make Gazans stay in Sinai. These are open plans. Israel has been subject to ridiculous diplomatic pressure over the last not year or two, 20 years since Mubarak, to resettle Gazan Palestinians in the Sinai, and Egypt has refused consistently. Now it's very much open. Everyone knows the U.S. wants Egypt to resettle Gaza, and unfortunately, this is an open discourse. This is ethnic cleansing. When you say take them to Gaza, this is you want to ethnically cleanse Gaza. You want to empty the place. It's another Nakba. It's another 1948, but in 2023. Um, so yeah, Egypt has the obligation, of course, to open, but also let's remember that Israel attacked the crossing about 5 times now, and even injured 9 Egyptian civilians. Uh, if we want to go back to international legal discourse allows Israel to say, "Oops, sorry, it was by mistake." I don't think it was by mistake. I think it's to deter Egyptians at the frontier. But international legal discourse always allows states to say, "Sorry, it was by mistake." Now imagine if an armed group bombed a frontier region where protesters are present. Uh, Imagine the the international community's response. Imagine if an armed group attacked 6 journalists in a filmed incident where there was no crossfire, nothing, just a targeted attack against 6 journalists. Imagine if an armed group does that. Now you have Reuters and AFP. Uh, Reuters said six journal. Reuters photographer dies in southern Lebanon. You might even think he died, in a car accident between Sur and I don't know, and Saida, for example. And then Reuters, under pressure, changed it, and they made it that he was killed by a mortar shell from the direction of Israel, just from the direction of Israel. We don't know the physical force that moved the shell, and then AFP said he was killed in crossfire. One last question: imagine if a mortar shell hits a hospital in Israel today, and 500 people die. Would anyone ask? Would anyone analyze the crater? Would anyone wonder if any other possibility than the terrorists is behind this heinous act? This is the question. The solution is to work with international law, to work in public discourse, but to be very attentive to the political context of gentrification, of colonialism, of racism, and of the white supremacist prejudice that informs everything that we've been talking about.
That was all really interesting, extremely depressing, but very insightful. Thank you so much.
It's really in line with the thesis of our entire podcast. If I don't know if you've seen any of our other episodes, but
Yeah, I did see some stuff.
mostly anti-imperial leftist discourse all around.
Thank you so much. That was really awesome.
Thank you, Abdelghany.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Arwa.